hope you're having a great day. You're listening to TechFest Talks, a podcast by students for students. My name is Rory McIver, and I'm a sixth-year student at Portlethen Academy with a big interest in all things music and the creative ways it can be made during these strange pandemic times with isolation and travel restrictions. That is why I'm extremely excited to be speaking to composer Laura Bowler and soprano Juliette Fraser today, who just last month were a part of Sound Festival's Flight Free Music Festival. Laura composed a unique new chamber work titled Distance, performed here in Scotland by soloist Juliette, along with a live-streamed Thalia ensemble all the way from New York through Zoom. A very good morning to you both. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll get into more detail about this incredible achievement.
Hi, I'm Laura Bowler, and I'm obviously, as Rory said, the composer of this new chamber work, Distance. Most of my work is socio-politically engaged, so this was very much within my comfort zone in that sense. But it was a work that was very much outside of my comfort zone in every other sense, due to the inevitable difficulties of working in this unusual format. But it was made joyous by the kind of camaraderie of everyone, having the intention of just making it happen despite its difficulties.
And I'm Juliet Fraser. I'm a soprano, a classical soprano specialising, I suppose, in the weirdest or wackiest edges of contemporary classical music. And yes, this is pretty much a project unlike any other that I have done, but we'll talk a bit more about that in due course, I expect.
Yeah, thank you guys. So when and how were you asked to get involved in this year's Flight Free Sound Festival?
I was asked, when were we asked, Juliet? I'm not sure, maybe even like about a year or maybe just over a year before the festival happened. We knew that Fiona Robertson, the artistic director of Sound Festival, was planning to have a Flight Free festival, and that was prior to the pandemic, that she was planning to do this anyway. I can't exactly remember. Can you, Juliet?
Well, I think that I saw Fiona at New Music Dublin, which would have been in February 2020. And I think it was at that point that she told me about the Flight Free Festival and said that she was cooking up. But I think that the conversations in earnest about the shape that this piece might take then started over Zoom inevitably once we'd all gone into lockdown. That's my memory.
Ah, okay, so that's really interesting that it was actually a pre-pandemic plan.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your initial reaction to this exciting project, and what attracted you to work on it?
I'll let you go first, Juliet.
Well, you know what I'm going to say, don't you, Laura?
Yes.
Well, I suppose I should separate the idea of a Flight Free festival. I thought was quite interesting, and perhaps we'll talk about that as a concept in a bit later on. But when we had our first meeting about this idea of doing a piece which very much engaged with the fact that musicians couldn't be in the same place at the same time, and therefore would use technology, which frankly I dread, such as Zoom, in order to bring us together, I was deeply, deeply sceptical. I really managed to avoid doing any live streamed concerts through the first lockdown. I know that a lot of artists really felt the need to keep engaging with the outside world, and were performing via live stream feeds or what have you. That's really not so much my style. I think I love being in a room with people, and I love the process of rehearsing with people and sharing music for an audience and creating some sort of magic in that space with people. So the idea of not being able to do that was really counter to all my instincts. But I stuck with the idea, and I do remember thinking, I'm not sure that this is a good idea. I'm not sure that anyone can pull this off. But if anyone can pull it off, I think Laura is the person. And also Talia are fantastic. So I felt that as a team, we had a strong chance of doing something interesting with it, but I could not imagine how that was going to come to be.
And for myself, I was really excited at the prospect, but then I'm always deeply excited by something that sounds probably impossible, like something I shouldn't be doing. I think I'm just drawn to those kind of formats or ideas. And I'd always wanted to work with Juliet and Talia Ensemble, so that was obviously a big draw for me. But I was deeply aware of Juliet's reservations, and I really wanted to make this project as kind of as rich an experience as possible for Juliet, so that sensation of being in a rehearsal space on your own, rather than collaborating with other musicians, that somehow was fulfilled, and so that brought about the idea of, I suppose, making the piece quite theatre focused, and so we brought a movement director on board to work on that aspect. And I think just having that extra person in the rehearsal room to have conversations with and collaborate with inevitably filled some of that gap, if probably not all of it, but filled some of it, hopefully, for Juliet. But I think for me, it's just the opportunity to do something that also puts me outside of my comfort zone as a composer, because I'm quite the control freak when it comes to my work. And there's inevitably aspects of working in this way that you can't control. Like, what if the internet just goes down? And so that required a different kind of psychological headspace, both in the composition of the piece, but also in practice when it was being premiered. So that's quite interesting. I think it's good to challenge ourselves as artists.
Yes, thank you. That's really interesting how you both adjusted to this kind of new type of project. So, do you both think that flight-free festivals like this should happen more often? And if so, why?
I have quite mixed feelings about that, I think. Personally, I've been committed to reducing, if not eliminating, my my air travel for several years. So I'm completely behind that as an idea, but I'm not sure that flight-free festivals is where it needs to stop. I think it needs to be more of a broader industry shift that supports well, just the examination of the carbon footprint of everything that we do, and of course, traveling by train is one good way to do that. But I think we have to acknowledge that firstly, it's much more expensive to travel by train than to fly, which of course is not how it should be, but it is how it is, and particularly at the moment in the pandemic. The other thing is that it does impact on programming choices. So it was very interesting talking to Fiona Robertson and discovering, well, probably maybe a lot of people know this already, but many instruments are actually not allowed on various trains. Eurostars, for example, or French national trains will not accept double basses. So that has a big impact on the way that you program, and one doesn't want to be eliminating the use of certain instruments because of choosing to have a flight-free festival. So I think I think just opting for the flight-free festival model is not going to solve the problems, but it's one way of shining a spotlight on the issues, and for the moment really just discovering what the problems are that arise out of that, and therefore then adapting the model or adapting the attitude.
I completely agree with Juliet and can't say it any better. But the only thing I'd add is that for me, it's a provocation to the rest of the industry to consider this, and I think that's a good thing. But like Juliet, it's not necessarily a kind of model that can be utilised going forth in like numerous festivals, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
The one other thing that came to mind just as Laura was saying that is that I think it's important that we acknowledge that culture thrives through diversity, and if you start restricting something like like travel, then you can end up kind of entering into a slight sort of bubble situation where you're repeatedly asking artists that are within geographical reach of that festival. So there are a lot of competing issues, I think, to hold in mind when thinking about travel and thinking about carbon footprint and such. It's not a simple thing for sure.
No, it's definitely a complex issue, but definitely an interesting topic to discuss as well. So, Laura, have you composed anything like Distance before in your career?
I certainly haven't composed anything that has half of the musicians across the ocean at the same time. In other aspects, I have like work that is in some way socio-politically engaged. That's very much the theme of most of my work. And also, I've composed many works that are looking at the climate crisis through various different lenses. But certainly not in this format. It's very, very different and was a challenge.
I'm sure that's why Fiona approached Laura, that she knew that Laura's pedigree, if you like, for engaging with these huge topics in an intelligent and creative and sensitive way was going to help all of us. Laura's body of work is just amazing, and well, I went to see. I think it was your latest piece before you'd done Distance, House's Slide. Is that right? That was the piece you wrote before, which was, well, maybe you want to say a word about it because I'll probably get it wrong, but
oh, thanks, Juliet. It was a work for the London Sinfonietta and the soprano Jessica Rizzoli, and it centred around verbatim responses to 3 questions that were posed to the general public about climate change or their relationship with the environment. And we collated these verbatim responses into a libretto of sorts. But the fundamental aspect of the work was that it was bike-powered. So all of the lighting and the amplification was bike-powered, and our soprano was also cycling while singing through the work. And it was one of those joyous moments where the form of the presentation, it matches with the content. And the physicality and the effort required to power the piece to happen existed very much as a mirror to the joint effort that is required to tackle the many complexities of the climate crisis. And I think there's aspects of that form meeting content in Distance as well, which is something that really interests me, but is always one of the hardest things to manage.
I was really struck by just this question about basically the effort, either physically or financially or politically, of powering something when I went to see this other piece by Laura, House's Slide, and it's really stuck with me, just the cost, basically the environmental cost of what we do with technology on stage, as an aside.
Yeah, so you had to consider the sound lagging and other technological issues when composing Distance, and this is the first time you've had to do this in your composing career. So what had to change or be adjusted because of this?
It's quite interesting because I think a lot of people might assume that I changed lots of things about my compositional approach, and I did consider that. I did consider writing scores that had more freedom, and that was maybe more improvisatory or more aleatoric in terms of its presentation. But actually what I thought was far more interesting was to attempt to do something that truly requires ensemble communication across an ocean. I thought that was a more interesting provocation, because then we're really, really engaging with the difficulties that are inevitable with the lag. And I think what was interesting is that in the rehearsal space, the lag was a different length, different duration to the lag in the performance space, which inevitably affected how Thalia Ensemble were hearing Juliet in relation to what they were playing. So I think in the actual performance, it was like half a second lag or something like that. So they would hear Juliet half a second later than where they had played in the bar, for instance. And so it was a matter of them getting used to that. And also, one of the key things about the work is technically that Thalia Ensemble couldn't see Juliet. They could only hear Juliet, whereas Juliet could see Thalia Ensemble because Thalia Ensemble were being projected onto a screen, which inevitably makes the form of communication very different. So throughout the entire rehearsal process, they couldn't see any of us in the UK. It was all done via communication, via just speaking, which was inevitably changed the rehearsal process as well. But I think the only thing that significantly was a decision compositionally that was directly related to lag was in the more kind of ensemble-based, more complex ensemble playing section. I put quite obvious percussive hits into the score in order for both parties, both Juliet and the ensemble, to have things like places to recover almost. So if things got out of sync, it was a moment where we could get back into sync if necessary. But aside from that, I kind of approached it more with the concept that if the lag does cause problems, that becomes part of the work rather than trying to avoid it.
Wow, that's really interesting. So when you actually went into the rehearsal room, was there anything from your original plans that you had to alter or change?
I can't remember. I don't think there was anything super significant that had to be changed. I think maybe we all knew that the rehearsal process was going to be quite laborious in some way. I think, but I don't remember anything specifically technical that had to change. We did have an incredible technical team though on both sides of the pond, which made it so much easier because without them, there's no way it could have happened. So I think that's really important to mention. But I don't know, Juliette, do you remember anything that we had to change?
No, I think you're right. I don't remember anything in terms of the material really changing. There were a couple of moments when I think we added a couple of percussion strikes to help, just as you've said. But my main reflection is that it was the rehearsal process itself that had to adapt. I think you go in with the old habits about how you rehearse a piece, and certainly this dominant habit of just being as efficient as possible. And we kind of had to let go of that again on both sides and find a much more patient, simpler way of working, mainly because you can't have multiple discussions going on in the two spaces at the same time. So whenever Thalia, for example, would be having multiple discussions, the result was that in Aberdeen we couldn't hear anything that any of them were saying. So it was about figuring out how to streamline communication, just always down to one person in each space communicating. That took a bit of adapting, but we got there.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It must have been quite tricky to have to work with that new rehearsal technique. So, Juliet, I understand that you've never sung in a project of this kind before. So, what did you find more challenging when singing with an ensemble through a screen?
Well, I'm afraid it was the things that I'd anticipated. It was the sense of feeling quite exposed or quite isolated, that you don't even if you're hearing sound through speakers, that there isn't that kind of physical. Well, there aren't the bodies around you. You don't so much feel part of an ensemble. The challenges of the rehearsal process, I suppose, just a bit of fear of how it was going to come together. I think it's worth saying that in some ways I think my job was easier than Thalia's because, as Laura has said, they were the ones dealing with the time lag. So for me standing in Aberdeen, I was always singing with what I was hearing, thankfully. Whereas they were playing with what they were hearing late, or rather they were having to ignore what they were hearing in order for us not to get stuck in this kind of feedback loop of everybody waiting for everybody else, and then everything just getting slower and slower and slower. So I think their job as musicians was harder than mine, having to play against what you're actually hearing. But then there's with all those difficulties, this whole lovely avenue of excitement opens up, that you are, after one slightly stressful day of rehearsal, let's say, this avenue of excitement opens up that you are beginning to make it work, and you are finding solutions to the problems, and that you might yet pull it off. And that it was completely brilliant, being part of an adventure that did feel like it was really pushing at the limits of what was possible, and feeling this sense of the team pulling together. That was something really beautiful. I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed the most. As Laura said, the camaraderie, but the kind of the collective determination to try and make something work despite the obstacles.
And you've worked with the Thalia Ensemble before, so did this make the experience any easier for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought it would, but in the end, the distance means that you can't really share a naughty glance with somebody or crack a quiet joke on the side, because of everything that I've just said. You're really not in the same space, and the way that the microphones pick up mean that you can't do any of that kind of hidden stuff. So I never got to hug them really, or say hi to them. So I'm not sure that it made that much difference, perhaps apart from the fact that because we've worked together, we went into it kind of invested in the idea of pulling it off. I mean, you'd hope that everybody would do that, but I think if I were working with an ensemble that was completely unknown, probably I would have been a bit more frightened, a bit more self-conscious, and that sort of thing. So yes, I think in some ways it helped.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if we take a bit of a deeper dive into the meaning of the piece, Laura, could you explain to us the different forms of distance that you explored as important themes throughout this piece?
Yes, I will try. It's always very strange when your head is in another project, and then you're trying to reflect back on a project from a few months ago. But essentially, so inevitably, there was the very apparent distance, which was the physical distance between Juliette and the ensemble. But one of the things, which is something I'm super grateful to Juliette for, was before I started writing, I sent a few questions to Juliette that were about various things. Some of them were about climate change directly, some of them were about the experience of flying, some of them were about her experience as a performer during the pandemic. So lots of different angles, I suppose, to the questions. And in one of Juliette's answers, she referred to the social anthropologist writer Timothy Ingold. And in her very brief kind of reference to him, I suddenly was like, oh, that's interesting. So naturally, I bought every book by Timothy Ingold and devoured them in a space of kind of 2 weeks. And it was his writing on both flight travel, but also on the nature of how we as a species relate to our environment, and how the transport networks that have been created across the globe have kind of directly affected our relationship to the natural world, and how the difference we feel when we are kind of wayfaring or, say, walking through a landscape and actually physically engaging with it, compared to our sensation and relationship to the planet when we are, say, flying over it. And he talks about the psychological distance we have with the environment as a result of that. So there's that aspect of it, which is almost like empathetic distance. So that if we're not close enough to something, for some reason, our empathy reduces. So there was that aspect of the work, both in relation to empathy towards people, but also empathy towards our natural world. But also another aspect of it, which came about to create the form of the work, was the process that data goes on when it is transferred. So the different stages of kind of encoding and compression, etc., and decoding and caching and all of that. And I kind of drew a relationship between that and then the process that we go on as human beings when we take a flight. So the idea that when we board a flight, we become part of the manifest, we are encoded into the space, we go through the experience of oxygen deficit on flight travel and how that then relates to kind of the compression. And there were lots of different things that related between what we go through psychologically when we take a flight and we land in a place having not actually moved. Our body hasn't physically engaged with the idea of movement. And Timothy Ingalls writes about this beautifully. I'm definitely not capable of truly encapsulating everything he writes about this. But there were so many aspects to his writing that I drew from. And so there were all of these different angles within the piece. And as a result of that, we felt it in many different ways. There were multiple screens, multiple ways of kind of live feed. And also there were moments where Juliette was lip syncing with herself. And we also heard some of Juliette's verbatim responses to my questions. And then I used my own voice using Juliette's text. So there was lots of different playing with how we change with people, how we change as people during flight, but also in terms of our relationship to flight travel and flight travel's relationship to the environment. So there were loads of different aspects looked at.
Thanks for that insight. So a few final questions for you both. What did you learn from this experience? And if you were to work on something like this again, is there anything you would do differently?
Juliette, do you want to go first?
I think this project was very, very, very special. I feel like it was in special hands, mostly Laura's hands, but also just the whole team. Fiona's vision for making it happen at all, and the tech team were just extraordinary. As Laura said, without them, what we as musicians would have been doing would have been completely irrelevant. I'm certainly not volunteering to do something else like this. As I said at the beginning, I live for chamber music. Really, I live for live music making, and that's what I want to get back to doing. So it doesn't. I have to be honest and say that this doesn't, for me, kind of stimulate a desire to do more projects of this vein. However, it absolutely stimulates a desire to do this project again and to get a little bit further with it. And fortunately, we do have two more performances of it lined up for next summer, so that's really exciting to me. There were also aspects of what Laura was asking me to do as a performer which excited me, which I'd be really happy to explore more. And it was just a complete joy to work with Laura, so I'm hoping that we have the chance to do other pieces, other projects together further down the line. But I think in a way, every project that I'm asked to do is somewhat unique, given the number of premieres that I do. And this was special because it was really grappling with big questions, and mostly I just feel very privileged that I was able to be part of that, and glad that I ignored my initial reservations to stay on board and be part of it.
It's quite similar to Juliette, really, my feelings about it, because it's, for me, it was about trying to make the format that Fiona initially proposed match the content. And so I can't really imagine doing another work in this way, purely because then I'd have to find another content that worked with it. And I think there's kind of a beauty in it, the marriage that happened between the format and what we were trying to communicate in this aspect. And I think that the richness of the project comes from that, and attempting to kind of deal with these technological difficulties without the concept that you're communicating in some way relating to it doesn't quite make sense to me as a creative. And I think that I would rather find a different challenge, if possible.
Well, I think we can all agree that this project was a huge creative and technological achievement for you both. Thank you so much, Juliet and Laura, for giving us such great insight into this work. And it was great to have you both here today. Stay tuned for more episodes from TechFest Talks, and bye for now. Thank you.